What are we going to do with all this?
I don't know.
What should we make?
So, without snobwood being available, we decided on the next best thing, firewood. We can build a guitar with our leftover scraps. Bringing them into the house and furiously planing a piece to see if it was viable, we made a pyramid-shaped piece of wood and further cut down to size on a saw blade 5mm too small to get to the end, so finishing off by hand. This was an incredibly boring and laborious process. Checking to see if we had enough wood, the small monkey helped dance her way through the placement of the pieces. And by nightfall we had a shape, so we couldn't eat at the table that night. We needed to wait for the photos to develop. Pieces rough cut, back to the saw, which cut 5mm from the bottom each time, and finished off again by hand to get a closer finish to see if we could actually get some pieces to touch together to build a guitar body. Sanding was the most obvious way of flattening out these things and hopefully making sure that they would fit together in a useful fashion. Many iterations later, using a pencil for the first time, this aspiring luthier marked, glued, and chopped his fingers to, well, pieces in an attempt to build a shape. This was the most complicated 6-piece puzzle he had ever taken on. Looking at him think, it could be, it couldn't be, oh no, he's gone straight for the glue. Using super glue to help hold it together, as clamps just wouldn't work at this stage. There was a couple of times he had to take a scalpel to his fingertips to prise them apart. Unfortunately, we were laughing too much to take the videos at that point. Oh, apparently he's moved on to the truss rod and neck. For the second time in his life, using a pencil, marking out with a ruler, and often using 2 pairs of glasses as his failing eyes deceived him, he marked out the position of the truss rod and rough places, perhaps where the pickups would go, and a slight angle on the neck. After this was done, he used a homemade template to root out the cavity for the truss rod, and I think here he is showing you that he could put a line in the middle of a hole. The fingerboard here is a piece of larch, no, it's a piece of wood that he took from his garden, and carefully cutting and sawing some slots well measured, as you can see. And look, he even showed us a slow-mo picture of him doing it, and taken from a very popular website, some distances and measurement markings made. A few times this was an error, and the board had been sanded down and started again. At this point, he wished he had more clamps, but using your fingers in this fashion is not a great idea, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. Clamp your work. Eating sweets and testing out whether it fits. He's just decided, well, this is how it works. This is how they do it. You glue it up, you stick it down. He did use 2 pins to hold it, and 24 hours later the clamps came off, and there it was. Now he decided, that's it, we're going to take out a piece of some of the wood at the back just to help shape the neck a little bit easier. And here he is, cutting down the neck to its approximate width. I don't know if you can see that from the video, but that's apparently what he's doing. And here he goes again, checking sure. Oh, making a little, yes, chopping away at the wood, slashing away. Here, struggling to count the distances where the markers are needed. And we'll see a rubber coming. Oh, there it goes, the rubber cutting out the wrong one. And never drilling before, taking some tips and testing to see which drill piece would work and how deep you need to do it, he decided just to go for it. Cutting away by hand again. No clamps. But the dots seemed to be useful and they were glued in with super glue. Back to shaping the neck. Trimming it down even further. This would make the radiusing slightly easier, which again, with varying grits of sandpaper, took hours. But very pleased with the finished article. It was a laurel fretboard, cut down from a tree in our garden to make shape. We gave it a few coats of tung oil, just for the first coat diluted with a small amount of white spirits. And as you can agree, that was the last time it looked good.
Can I have a pee, please, Bob?
Yes.
Blockbusters!
And there you go, the only humour in the video. Fitting the pieces, the sides together. I can't tell you how many days that took, but we all got old and my beard fell out. And because it was all glued and clamped by hands, it was of no reasonable thickness or shape or size. And so a handmade, using the hand router, we managed to thin it down just enough for it to be usable. And a lot of sanding later, it looked like I had glued some bits of wood together. I lost a day and a half. This video is actually speeded up 600 times. And I can't see any plasters on my fingers, but I'm sure there was a good few accidents. Finally, using a ropey technique, it was finished, and we had almost half a side of a guitar, sanding with the brand new sander that I still haven't told the wife how much it cost. Not content with just gluing it, I decided to follow the lines and accentuate them by putting smaller pieces of darker wood inside. Here's the block, cutting it off 5mm shy at a time and finishing it off by hand and thinning it down to the exact level and squeezing it into the gaps. This also took some amount of time, but the dry fit worked, so we glued it in place and chiseled it all off. Even the cameraman at this stage was bored of proceedings, but we finished it off anyway. The end result looked remarkably good for someone with no real skills at all. And here we go with the fretboard again, cleaning out the slots from the oil and the tongue and making sure they're at the right depth. And as a word of warning, never do this on the floor without clamps. It bounces all over the place, and a few times you end up smacking the fretboard itself, which is not pleasant, as you can see the ding marks there. The most fun part is using the rasp and shaping the neck. And just as the red rum joke started, that was the last laugh was had from the wood as he sanded straight through to the truss rod at the back. A small piece of wood filled in, sanded, and extra shavings pushed through with superglue seemed to have fixed the situation. Many hours of sanding and filing and another day and a half lost just by angling out the neck. And here, taking off as much material as possible so that we could do the final sanding of the shape. And there it is, ladies and gentlemen. No design for the headstock needed, just a pencil and a rough guide to show where the cut could be. And even here again, the cameraman is pleased with his sloppy work. When getting ready to clamp it, it was a case of using a piece of paper to see how close the gap was before finally getting it to an acceptable level that we could clamp it together. And again, well, weigh it to see what the damage was. A few fails, many fails, but this is this man's third attempt at building a guitar. Measure once, measure twice, and still get it wrong. The hole is clearly nowhere near its intended dot, so we had to fashion a puck with hands to fill it. Using a chisel, I'm quite pleased with his handiwork that it hadn't gone through and severed any of his tendons. The puck was made and glued and battered in place, and the correct placings for the holes were then drilled. Slightly more successful after a false start. Too wide for the drill press, we had to do this one by hand. Oh, and it turns out he did need a back cavity as well for the electronics, which he's furiously making now as a big afterthought. I would be speaking more, but I'm not paid for my time, and it's fairly obvious what's going on. Final mixing of tung oil and white spirits, and we'll see what happens to the back. Turns out, it's shiny. Over the next preceding days, we gave it a few more coats and let it sit in. The truss rod hole cover was made, but it was too large, and we ended up making a slightly smaller one later on. But here's the fretwork, with the frets protected with masking tape, and used a rocker and filing, and polished with metal polishing compound. You can see where the tape didn't last, and even though there's still dirt on the fretboard, is very pleased at only his third attempt of a neck. The action was far too high, as he'd never done a tunematic bridge before, so an extra hole had to be drilled just to sink the tunematic bridge down to allow a decent height of playability. No nut slot gauges, nothing like that. Just a simple direct copy from a Fender. Using a scalpel to trace the spacings to give us a head start on the saw. The bone nut was made, and the soldering was done, and amazingly, the guitar was finished. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to my wonderful